Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to begin a series of matches and deck profiles that take a deep dive look into one of my favorite formats of all time, the 2006 summer format, often referred to as Chaos Return. Now, for modern players who have found interest in formats like Goat Control, the gameplay of Chaos Return format is very similar to Chaos Return. However, many of the players that I have encountered over the course of the last several years who are just now getting into something like GOAT format often complain about the Trinity: Graceful Charity, Pot of Greed, and Delinquent Duo. Well, Chaos Return format is a very similar format in terms of gameplay, but actually only has one of those three pieces of Trinity: Graceful Charity. Now, granted, there is a switch between Confiscation and Delinquent Duo that can be quite frustrating, but Pot of Greed is banned. You don't have to worry about your opponent using Pot of Greed. And if you've enjoyed the idea or have enjoyed the idea, setting flip effect monsters and baiting out back rows and making reads as the game progresses, and you've been doing GOAT format in order to achieve that, well, Chaos Return format is equally as enjoyable. The gameplay is very similar, the card pool is very similar, but there are also some significant changes to the ban list and to sets that I think improve the overall quality of the game. So if you've been playing GOAT format, I highly recommend taking a look at Chaos Return format as well. Now let's see what takes Chaos Return format to that level. So for me, Chaos Return format centers around a couple cards: Chaos Sorcerer and Return from the Different Dimension. Everything that happened during that 6-month, actually a little bit less, period of time really centered around the popularity of those two cards. Chaos Sorcerer, as players know who have been playing older formats like Goat Control, is one of the most powerful cards from Invasion of Chaos. However, it was overshadowed upon release by both Black Luster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon. As a result, Chaos Sorcerer was pushed off to the side until limitations or bannings to Chaos Emperor Dragon and Black Luster Soldier allowed Chaos Sorcerer to emerge as one of the most powerful monsters in the game. However, once that happened, it still took a little while for Chaos Sorcerer to really find its way into decks in more than just a singleton copy. Some players just took Black Luster Soldier out, threw in Chaos Sorcerer, and called it a day. However, as the summer of 2006 got rolling, Chaos Sorcerer's popularity really started to rise, and in the middle of the summer, it reached its peak, where virtually every top deck was running 3 copies. Deck design was very limited to lights and darks, and most players focused their attention on either how to implement a Chaos Sorcerer strategy or counter a Chaos Sorcerer strategy, and even that second part often meant combining it with Chaos Sorcerer itself. The reason this is referred to as Chaos Return format is because almost every top deck had 3 copies of Chaos Sorcerer, so much so that it was eventually banned at the end of the format. Next, the Return part. Return from the Different Dimension has always been one of the most powerful cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Paul Leviton showed how powerful it was when he combined it with Bazoo the Soul Eater to win his first SJC championship years prior, but as the formats progressed, Chaos Sorcerer became best friends with Return from the Different Dimension, and that was no more clear than during Chaos Return format. Whether it was Iman or Michelle Gruner, top players implemented strategies with 3 Chaos Sorcerers and 3 Return from the Different Dimensions in order to give this really great card advantage engine deck. I'm talking about a deck with Tokoichi and Magician of Faiths and Tsukiyomis and Sangans, with a card like Return from the Different Dimension that can win the game out of nowhere, shift the tempo in your favor. It could even generate card advantage if you're bringing back things like DD Warrior Lady or Sangan, and make it so that the deck has not only a card advantage engine, but also a very clear win condition. Now, as things progress throughout the format, and we'll get into this in some of the upcoming decks and deck profiles, not every deck simply just played Sorcerer and Returned from the Different Dimension and called it a day. The second part of this format that I really appreciate is how deck building shifted as the months went on. As Return from the Different Dimension got popular, then people started to counteract it with Royal Decree. As Royal Decree got popular, then other strategies started to rise in popularity. And although everything really centered around that Chaos Sorcerer vacuum, where almost all of the decks, even the decks designed to beat Chaos, had Chaos Sorcerer, the actual inclusion of what lights and darks to support Chaos Sorcerer changed. And over the course of the next several videos, we are going to watch how this format evolved, how certain tech cards evolved. And although every week or every couple weeks we're going to return to talking about Chaos decks during Chaos Return format, I promise each deck is going to have their own unique strategy and their own way of utilizing one of the most powerful cards printed during this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that for many formats was overshadowed, but finally got to shine during the summer of 2006. So without further ado, this is our first deep dive look into the 2006 summer format. and in this video, we are going to take a deep dive look into the format's namesake. Let's start by talking about a deck with 3 Chaos Sorcerers and 3 Return from the Different Dimensions. Alright, so we'll begin with this deck's namesake, or at least the Chaos portion of this deck's namesake. At this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Black Luster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon have been banned, however, Chaos Sorcerer is at 3. It would actually be forbidden at the end of this format, and would remain forbidden all the way up to approximately Tengu Plant format, so it would find itself on the ban list for quite a significant amount of time. But as modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are finding with GOAT format, Chaos Sorcerer was absolutely one of the most underutilized cards during the first year or so after it was printed. Obviously, it was overshadowed by Black Luster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon, but after those cards were banned, Chaos Sorcerer remained as the final Chaos monster. And although it took a little while, players slowly but surely added more and more Chaos Sorcerers to the deck until we get to Chaos Return format, where players just fully committed to the 3 full copies. So this deck is going to, of course, run 3 copies of Chaos Sorcerer, and we need to run a variety of lights and darks in order to support that. We'll have arguably the best light monster, Cyber Dragon. I think from a modern perspective, Cyber Dragon is a little bit overrated, or maybe was overrated. Virtually every deck played 3 Cyber Dragons. Obviously, the ability to special summon it, maybe bait out a Bottomless Trample, and then maintain your normal summon was pretty good. But I think it's easy to play around when you go back and play these old formats. I'm curious what it would be like if we went back and redefined this format like we've redefined GOAT format. I think people would cut Cyber Dragon a little bit. But nevertheless, at least in 2006, it was basically staple to run a full 3 copies of Cyber Dragon, especially if you're running Chaos Sorcerer. The other really powerful light monster that virtually every deck like this elected to run were copies of Zaborg, the Thunder Monarch. Zaborg plus Cyber Dragon is obviously a great combination. Tempo can destroy a face-down Koichi, and if your opponent doesn't have Snatch Steal, a Sakuratsu Armor, or a live Chaos Sorcerer, it can be really hard to deal with a 2400 monster. So there's absolutely that synergy there between Cyber Dragon and Zaborg. This deck also can slow the game down with some of its flip effects. It doesn't have a ton of protection, but there's plenty of flip effects, plenty of field presence, so you can slow the game down and make it so that the Zaborg is live, whether it's with Cyber Dragon or without. And then, of course, you can always tribute summon a Chaos Sorcerer after using its effect. So 2 copies of Zaborg. I've elected to include this because it's authentic to the time period, but I think modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has certainly redefined the use of a card like Jinzo. Jinzo plus Return from the Different Dimension is obviously a good combination, that pseudo trap stun effect. So it might be warranted in the deck, but I think modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Players have largely cut Jinzo when going back to play old formats, but it was a very common, dark, synergizes with return monster that a lot of these decks played. So those are the tribute monsters. In terms of the support light and dark, we're going to see a lot of flip effect monsters in order to generate card advantage, clog the board, dig into Return to the Different Dimension, or fuel your graveyard. Really a combination of any of those. So one of the most common monsters was, of course, Koichi, the Battle Chanted Locomotive. This card really saw a lot of play from 2006 into 2007, maybe a little bit after that, depending on the format, whether it's in Monarch decks, Chaos decks. You can even go back to GOAT format in 2005 and see a little bit of Koichi being played, certainly more if you play the modern version of GOAT format. So at this point, though, 3 copies of Koichi, very common in Chaos Return decks. We have 2 copies of Magician of Faith, very common in these type of decks. We do not have the full Trinity. Pot of Greed and Delinquent Duo are banned, but there's still some really powerful spell cards. Graceful Charity is legal, for example, even Confiscation. So there are plenty of cards you want to refuel with Magician of Faith. We have a pair of Magical Merchants, which were really good, both as a light monster, but also fueling your graveyard with Chaos Sorcerer. So you want to get as many light and darks in the graveyard as possible. This deck plays over 20 monsters. Virtually all the decks at this point had that really high monster count, especially those that played Magical Merchants. Then for some one-of light and darks, we have Sangin. Obviously going to search out a variety of great power cards from Magician of Faith to Koichi. We have Breaker the Magical Warrior, which is basically a pseudo-staple at this point. It's a dark monster too, which doesn't hurt. We have DD Warrior Lady, which is a light monster that a lot of players used. It's kind of an interesting one in the sense that it doesn't often go to the graveyard. Obviously, if you use its effect, it's never going to the graveyard. But with Return from the Different Dimension, it allows you to special summon a pseudo removal card, right? If you banished a DD Warrior Lady earlier in the game, when you use Return, if you're not actually winning the game, which might often just be the case anyway, but if you can't actually win the game, DD Warrior Lady can at least banish one of your opponent's monsters and make the return a 1-for-1 that probably pushes through damage. And if you are going for a game, DD Warrior Lady might be an instrumental part of that by attacking a Spirit Reaper, for example. So we have DD Warrior Lady. We have 1 copy of Tsukiyomi. We've got plenty of flip effect monsters, as you can see, a nice group here. 7 great flip effect monsters, 8 if you want to include a Night Assailant. This deck running Knight Assailant, it combines really well with Graceful Charity. That happened in GOAT format, that happens in Modern GOAT format, and it happened to a lesser extent here. We're not abusing it though with multiple copies. And then the only monster in this deck that cannot be banished with the Chaos Sorcerer, is not a light or dark, is Treeborn Frog. This was a very common card because instead of Graceful Charity plus Sinister Serpent being that really game-breaking sequence, Graceful Charity plus Treeborn Frog was also still pretty good. This deck has, obviously, the Zaborgs, Jinzo also for tribute monsters. Some decks elected to run things like Enemy Controller or even Metamorphosis to utilize the fact that it's level 1 or the fact that it's a free monster that comes back every turn. So there are some synergies with Treeborn Frog. It might seem a little bit out of place because typically that card is used with full Monarch decks with multiple Monarchs, triple Zaborg, multiple Dystaloses. But it's still a card advantage engine that can be utilized in a few different ways. And it makes it so that there's a sort of a pseudo new version of Trinity where you can Graceful Charity a Treeborn Frog instead of a Sinister Serpent. Now, it wasn't an absolute staple, but I think a lot of the Chaos Return decks at the time had Treeborn Frog, so I liked it to include it. In terms of the spells, we're going to have a spell lineup that's pretty reminiscent of a lot of decks from this time period. Obviously, the banned and restricted list changed what cards were legal, but at this time, cards like Nobleman of Crossout were basically pseudo-staples. Sometimes it was limited to 1, sometimes it was semi-limited. At this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, it was semi-limited. So obviously, we're going to be targeting Dekoichi, Magician of Faith, things like that. I mentioned Graceful Charity before. It is the only lone piece of the original 3 cards in Trinity legal during this format. No Pot of Greed, no Duo. Instead of Duo, though, we have Confiscation. Still costs 1,000 life points. You only get 1 card, so it is a 1-for-1, but you get to pick it. So there is some advantage there. It's not like if your opponent has Treeborn Frog, you have to ditch the Treeborn Frog, or they choose to ditch the Treeborn Frog like Duo. You actually get to pick the card. So there is a singleton Confiscation. Helps counteract some of the Cyberstein decks at the time. Then we have some power or singleton one-offs. You have a Book of Moon, which is pretty common. We have Snatch Steal and Premature. Not everyone ran Premature, but I think Premature is pretty solid, especially with cards like Chaos Sorcerer. This deck can win, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but you can put together big game swings. And this deck doesn't have a lot of extenders in the traditional sense. I mean, yeah, Chaos Sorcerer is a sort of an extender, I guess Cyber Dragon. But if your hand is clogged with a lot of normal summons, cards like Premature are pretty good. Right, you can Premature out a Cyber Dragon, attack over something, a Chaos Sorcerer, attack over something, Zaborg, attack over something, and still set a flip effect monster, which is real important. The 2 basically pseudo-staple spell and trap removal, Heavy Storm and Dust Tornado, Heavy Storm and Mystical Space Typhoon. They're both limited to 1. A single copy of Scapegoats, it was in fact limited to 1, right? This is a year after Go Control. And also a singleton copy of Metamorphosis, which was limited to 1 before it was eventually technically brought up to 2, banned in the interim as well, but Metamorphosis is interesting. This deck just has a lot of level 1s. It has Scapegoats, it has Treeborn Frog, it has Magician of Faith and Merchant like you would use in GOAT format. Thousand Eyes Restrict is still technically legal, so occasionally you would actually get into somewhat similar game states where your opponent has technically like the 1 Tsukiyomi, the 1 Scapegoat, the 1 Metamorphosis, and the 1,000 Eyes Restrict, like you may have seen back in Go Control in 2005. And there's also sort of the utility monsters in the extra deck, like Ryo Senshi using level 6 Chaos Sorcerers and a variety of others. So it does have a space. Not all decks played it. It absolutely was not a staple. It's a card that obviously requires something else, right? Metamorphosis alone doesn't do anything. Metamorphosis plus Treeborn Frog, pretty good. Metamorphosis plus a flip effect monster like Magician of Faith, pretty good. And then obviously Scapegoats, the singleton Scapegoats is pretty good. Next is the trap lineup. So the trap lineup is really what differentiates Chaos decks during this format. We call it Chaos Return format. So I have elected to profile Chaos Return itself first. So I've elected to maximize Return from the Different Dimension, which is sort of the second part of this deck's namesake, Chaos Sorcerer, and then Return from the Different Dimension. Return from the Different Dimension is just one of the most powerful cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. This card can swing the game in your favor in the blink of an eye. I already commented on bringing back DD Warrior Lady, but you could also theoretically bring back something like Sangan or Chaos Sorcerer, which if you're willing to crash into a monster, just use the effect, can also generate card advantage. Combos really well with Jinzo if you're willing to run Jinzo, where you would now have a pseudo trap stun, which also technically can 1-for-1 if your opponent were to do something, like for example, flip their own Return from the Different Dimension. This was basically one of the defining cards in the format that dictated deck building. As this series progresses and we dive deeper into this format, I'll talk about decks that actually main decked Royal Decree as a response to this and kind of watch how the format progressed. But we'll start sort of with the straightforward, clear-cut Chaos Return deck. 3 copies of Return. It's a win condition, a card advantage machine, one of the most powerful cards in the format, a card you basically always have to respect. Then we have Bottomless Trap Pull. This wasn't a staple. Some decks ran a Sakuratsu armor, some decks ran a Bottomless. It seemed like it was pretty common for decks to have one sort of secondary removal card because the staples at the time were Torrential and Mirror Force. And then a lot of decks had sort of a third card, whether it was the Sakuratsu armor, which they could have planned 3, but basically 1 Sakuratsu, 1 bottomless. And then a Call of the Haunted, which was sort of a pseudo-staple at this time, and it does synergize fairly well with a lot of what's in the deck. Jinzo, Sangan, Chaos Sorcerer, of course. But that is what our Chaos Return main deck looks like. I will talk about the extra deck. The extra deck is only useful if you somehow get Cyberstein on your side of the field, which if you're not running enemy controller or creature swaps, not overwhelmingly likely. You're not playing cards like Exchange, Monster Reborn is banned, but you theoretically somehow could get a Cyberstein on your side of the field. It's not impossible that your opponent could actually creature swap you their own Cyberstein. Like they'd use Cyberstein's effect, bring something out, maybe try to attack over the Cyberstein, and they had to make this push without back row removal, and you play Mirror Force or Book of Moon, and then suddenly you have Stein on the field. So you do want to have a full extra deck, and this specific version is actually running Metamorphosis to make it more obvious why this deck has an extra deck. But at this point, extra decks are unlimited. You really should basically just have access to at least one of most of the practical cards. Some players were pretty commonly actually showing up to events with 3 of every possible target. It was almost like a badge of honor to have the full extra deck. But I have a limited list of 15. That's simply because that's what modern players are used to. But when I'm talking about Cyber Twin Dragon, it really should just be multiple because there's no reason not to. But you should have Cyber Twin and Cyber End. These are both legal. They came out with Cyber Dragon. These are usually the cards that you go into off Cyberstein, and obviously you want to have access to them because they're usually the highest damage output, plus Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. Let's just say your opponent has a clear field. Cyber Twin on a clear field is the most. Cyber End Dragon is the best into a defense position monster, and then obviously Blue Eyes is just the single highest attack. You also had Master of Oz, though, as sort of a high output. Not quite as high as Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, but definitely something to consider. It's weaker in defense stats too, but there's those. Gatling Dragon is theoretically the best way to clear 3 monsters if you absolutely need to. Obviously, we need Thousand Eyes Restrict because we're running Metamorphosis. Arguably the best level 7 is The Last Warrior from Another Planet, and then you also have King Dragoon. Darkblade, obviously great to banish cards if your opponent's trying to summon their own Chaos monsters. Ojama Trio sometimes steals games out of nowhere. You can actually go into these reasonably with level 6s because you're running Chaos Sorcerer. Same is true with Senshi. Level 5s, you do need level 5s. You're running Zabork and Cyber Dragon, so Balter, Fiend Skull, and Reaper are the obvious ones. And I just have this dragon as a representation of the fact that you should have all the level 3s and all the level 4s. There are going to be circumstances where you Metamorphosis your on-field level 4 monsters to put a Dark in the graveyard for Chaos Sorcerer. That comes up. You should also technically have things like, the Light Magician, the one that came all the way back in LOB, and some of the earlier fusion monsters that are dark and light in order to potentially fuel Chaos Sorcerer. So this is just 15 of an example, but you really should have basically everyone that was legal at the time. In terms of decks that you could play against, this is kind of a weird one for me because I basically feel like the top decks at the time were just different versions of Chaos, and that seems kind of weird to list. I've elected to pick at least a couple decks that you could theoretically run into. Dark Worlds were out. I think they were more splash than full-time archetypes, meaning there really weren't enough Dark Worlds to play an entirely devoted Dark World deck. People sometimes put things like gold in their deck, usually as a response to an increase in popularity of Spirit Reaper. There's basically a positive correlation between those two cards, meaning as one variable goes up, the other goes up. The more Spirit Reapers in the format, the more gold people are willing to main deck. Because you do technically have the ability to discard this off of Graceful Charity and at least special summon it, which is pretty solid. You don't have a lot of other outlets, though. Maybe you need to main deck Morphing Jar if you're willing to do that, so at least you have 2 outlets, sometimes even Card Destruction 3, in order to summon this on your own. But if people are playing the Stalos, the Firestorm Monarch, and Spirit Reaper, maybe their own Morphing Jar, all of a sudden the popularity of cards like Gold and Silva tend to increase. So some iteration of Dark World, maybe full-blown, maybe just teched into a deck. I don't think Monarchs were great, but it was a deck that you saw. Occasionally it did top during this format. Vincent Tundo ran a FTK deck centered around Royal Magical Library at Nationals, did pretty well with it. You could still run into Warrior decks. I don't think they were great. And then sort of a variety of Chaos decks. There was a Banisher Kaiku Chaos deck we're eventually going to profile. There was a Recruiter Chaos deck that we're going to profile. There was basically just the Mirror Match, a Return from the Different Dimension version of this deck that I just profiled. Obviously a very common deck to play against. There was also considerations for Cyberstein decks, either fully devoted or sort of pseudo-Cyberstein, pseudo-control decks that were pretty popular. Several players had some great success with that, Cesar Gonzalez, for example. So I think Stein is also a deck you can consider. You could list things like Burn, Reversal Quiz FTK. There's a variety of, I'm going to talk about as tier 2 or 3 decks that you could run into, but I don't really think they were worth siding a lot for. So we're going to kind of limit, I'll leave this actually spread out, limit some of the tier 2 or 3 decks. I think reasonably these were some of the top decks that you could run, particularly as the format got going, where you're basically just going to play a bunch of Chaos Mirror matches, and the thing that differentiates each match is what your opponent's doing. Are they running a few Warriors? Are they running Decree? Are they running Return? Are they running Recruiters? Are they running Stein? It definitely varied from deck to deck. So in order to counteract some of these things, I'm going to have a pretty generic side deck. Mobius was very common. I really like Mobius because it can destroy Return to the different dimensions on your turn and make it so that your opponent can't use them as a win condition. They have to use them defensively. It's one of the best ways of dealing with Return, and I know it's not a light or dark, but it's a pretty reasonable way of counteracting that. It's also why I really like Dust Tornado. Dust Tornado is a twofold here, where it can destroy Return, but it can also set your Return safely during your opponent's end phase, and then you can use it to win the game on the following turn. So I think Dust Tornado is also fantastic. A quantity of Gravekeeper Spies I think is reasonable, especially in response to the Kaiku Banisher version of the deck. I'll talk about this eventually. I will profile it, but there was a version of Chaos that utilized these as light and dark, and the fact that they were anti-meta cards against Chaos, right? You summon Kaiku. This has been the case for a while now in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. You're 1, putting a beat stick on the field, 2, you're putting a dark on the field, and 3, your opponent can't summon Chaos monsters, and 4, you're chipping away at their graveyard. Well, Gravekeeper Spy is a great way of counteracting these monsters because of the attack threshold versus Spy's defense. Then I think you could reasonably have some cards for burn, kind of stall decks, which did exist. I don't think they're overwhelmingly great, but I don't think it's unreasonable. Death Wombat, a really common side deck. Decree as well. Decree could also theoretically counteract Return from the different dimension. Maybe you wanted to side out yours, so you side in Decrees. Azure Priest was really good against the Recruiter version of Chaos. Now, it depends on your perspective there. It's going to run through the Recruiters, but it's going to fuel their Chaos Sorceress, so there's a little bit of a debate on the merits of that, but I did see this in some side decks going back. And then put a Ceasefire in here. I don't want to say that people went out of their way to go into Time, but you will occasionally see players back in the day have unusual card choices in their side deck, seemingly anticipating going into Time, whether that's Poison of the Old Man or Ceasefire, anticipating a long match here or there, making sure they have a card in their side deck that can deal direct damage. This isn't a format where people are going to main deck a lot of that, so having a card in the side deck to do that could be beneficial. There are some side decks that had, emergency provisions, Ceasefire like I mentioned, Poison the Old Man, cards that just instantly on the moment you draw them can deal burn damage, which Ceasefire might not even necessarily do. If this is the last card you draw and you're the last player with a turn, it's not that great, but it is one of the better damage output burn cards, and it's also a card that you could side in if you feel like you're close to Time and you feel like the match you're going to have enough turns to draw into a bunch of cards, because this card can deal a ton of damage out of nowhere if there's a board stall. But nevertheless, this is our first look at Chaos Return, profiling as traditional of a Chaos Return deck as I could. I plan on returning to this format in the near future and profiling a variety of other versions of Chaos, but also chronicling how this format evolved over time. Anyway, thank you for watching. That's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.